Welcome, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on the place where you all are in the world. So welcome you all. I'm Patricia Vasconcelos, a Brazilian journalist, U.S. correspondent in the U.S. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to be hosting today on behalf of the Foreign Press this educational panel. I can see that all three guests are already here, so welcome you all. I'm going to say a quick hi for all of you, Luke, Ilaria, and also Scott. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you. So for all of you that are here with us, what we are going to discuss today, I'm going to give a brief background of our educational program. In the shadow of U.S. China rivalry, Europe is often overlooked in the global race to leading critical and green technologies. While Europe lags in some new and also emerging technologies, in other critical industries such as wind power and telecommunications, several European nations lead the way. So for all of you here, we are going to discuss with our experts how China is exposure to ecological and technological risks. I also would like to point out that this program is unique, is also organized by Enrich Foundation, a unique Asia-based philanthropic organization that works to advance mutually beneficial and sustainable global trade throughout research and educational programs. I'm going to introduce each of you accordingly, and I'm going to follow up with one question for each of you, and then we are going to open this discussion for the guests that are here with us today. So Luke Patey is a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, and also he leads senior research fellow at Oxford University Institute for Energy Studies at the University of Oxford. He's the author of How China Loses, the Pushback Against China Global Ambitions, Oxford University Press from last year, 2021. His work focuses on the intersection of China's trade, investment, and finance with its foreign and security policy. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, Financial Times, The Guardian, The Hindu, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy. He holds a doctorate and also an MSc from the Copenhagen Business School and a bachelor degree from Queen's University. Patty's last book was The New Kings of Crude, China, India, and the Global Struggle for Oil in Sudan and South Sudan. This is from 2014. So thank you very much again for joining us. A quick question for us in order to start this conversation. Luke, in your last book, How China Loses, right? If I am correct, and also, of course, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you argue that China's agenda had strong diplomacy and military expansion undermine its global ambitions to dominate the global economy. So from the time of the release of this book last year until now, a lot has changed in the world, especially regarding the war in Ukraine. So my question is, from the time that you released this book last year to now, regarding the war in Ukraine and all the new developments that we are seeing in the world, do you still have the same analysis that you had at that time?
Thanks, Patricia, and thanks for the Heinrich Foundation and the Foreign Press Association for organizing this event. On your question, I think the happenings that were going on in China's foreign relations over the past 10 years or so have continued on a similar path. And Those that I think upset China's global ambitions most have been the deteriorating relations with Europe, which I think have maintained their current state, and those of some of its neighbors in East Asia, mainly Japan. China has, I think, had positive relations with the global South that have been helping its foreign policy agenda to a large extent, with the important exception of India, where its relationship is still quite frayed because since there's a border dispute and fighting in 2020. So I think many of the same trends in China's foreign relations continue over the last sort of year or so since the book came out. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, but could you point out from your perspective what was the main change that happened after the war in Ukraine, and if this affects in any way your perspective of China and its goals?
I think that there hasn't been a unique change, I think, in how a lot of the West sees China, that there hasn't been a strong change in some of these frayed relations that China has in the U.S., with Europe and Japan. China's position on Ukraine has sort of kept the current state of relations quite steady. That Europe sees and the U.S. sees China as supporting Russia and its position and invasion of Ukraine.
Okay, we are going to talk more with you, and also we are going to try to a more interaction between the three of you. So, but I'm going to follow with the next guest, Ilaria Mazzocco. Did I pronounce correctly?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, then. Well, Ilaria Mazzocco, she's a fellow with the trustee chair in Chinese business and economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Prior, she was a senior research associate at the Postal Institute, where she led research on Chinese climate and energy policy for Micropolo, the Institute's think tank. She holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where her dissertation investigated Chinese industrial policy by focusing on electric vehicle promotion efforts and the role of local governments. She also holds master's degrees from Johns Hopkins and Central European University, as well as a bachelor degree from Bard College. So could you please describe for us and for the general public, if possible, in a more didactic way for us, what are the main ecological and also technological risks that, from your perspective, China faces nowadays in the competition with the West, especially regarding wind power and 5G, which is the main focus of this panel?
Well, I think Luke is really the expert here on wind power and 5G, so I don't know that I'll try and get too deep into that. Actually, I have looked more broadly at other technologies as well, including clean technology, so including solar and electric vehicles and wind. So I can speak a little bit about that. Rather than talking about China's the risks for China, I would say what we're seeing is a lot of growth in these areas for Chinese companies. So when you look at wind, certainly European companies still perform very well, and Chinese companies are predominantly focused in China in terms of the types of projects they're doing. But they're ranking very highly. When you look at the top 10, a lot of them are Chinese companies, right? So they're doing extremely well. So I think then Luke can tell us more about the competition, I think, with European companies. When you look at electric vehicles, which is another area where Chinese companies are really leading the way in technology, again, the European companies do well. American companies, Japanese companies also, and Korean companies also do well. But Chinese companies are really performing in a remarkable way, considering that they don't have an internationally established automotive industry in the traditional sort of internal combustion engine. So while we see that when it comes to internal combustion engine vehicles, Chinese companies are not that competitive. When you look at electric vehicles, they are performing extremely well in the Chinese market, which is a very large market. And so we'll see if they start performing well in the international market. That's really the next stage for them. Solar panels.
And what are the main challenges for them, in your opinion, in order to be more competitive?
Right. I'd say it's really branding, right? Solar panels, we know that Chinese solar panels sort of dominate the international market because this is really a commodity, right? But when it comes to electric vehicles, it's you and me having to decide which company, which brand we want to buy, right? And so there it really comes to an issue of familiarity, marketing, having an established presence in the local markets. In addition to that, I'd say there's also a political challenge, right? Traditionally, automakers produce domestically because there's a political advantage of doing so. I think the U.S. is really the area where we see that the most, where it's most obvious, right, with Japanese automakers in the 1980s, etc. But I think that's going to be a challenge for Chinese automakers, and so I think we're going to have to see whether or not they localize production as well, which hasn't happened until now.
Okay, great. So thank you. We are going to talk with Luke again, as you suggested, about specific about that topic regarding competition. Scott, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Happy Thursday for you. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Patricia. Happy Thursday. Well, thanks, and want to thank you, the Foreign Press Association and the Hinrich Foundation for bringing us together.
I'm finally more relaxed now because we had this problem with the Zoom ID, and I was like a little bit confused. So now I'm here. So you're talking that you're having a good Thursday. This is good.
Yes, yeah. So far, so good. And in part because I'm really excited for this conversation, as I'm sure we'll get to. A lot of virtually all of the policy conversation around China in the United States, whether it's technology or anything else, is very focused on the bilateral relationship. And so I'm really keen to kind of hear about this focus not only on Europe, but also this audience and to hear from those who are participating, your perspectives.
Let me introduce you. So Scott Moore, he's a political scientist, university administrator, and former policymaker whose career focuses on China, sustainability, and emerging technology. As director of China programs and strategic initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania, Scott Moore works with faculty members from across the university to design, implement, and highlight innovative, high-impact global research initiatives in areas including sustainability and also emerging technology. Dr. Moore directs Penn Global's for research and engagement fund programs, including those designed to support faculty-led projects in China, India, and also Africa, as well as its Risk Scholar program. In addition, Dr. Moore conducts research as an affiliate of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China and the Water Center at Penn, and teaches in the Department of Political Science. His first book, Subnational Hydropolitics, Conflict, Cooperation, and Institution Building in Shared River Basins, Oxford University Press from 2018, examines how climate change and other pressures affect the likelihood of conflict of water within countries. His latest, China's Next Act, good title, How Sustainability and Technology Are Reshaping China's Rise and the World's Future. This book is from this year, 2022. It explores how shared ecological and technological challenges force us to re-envision China's rise and its role in the world. Prior to Penn, Dr. Moore was a young professional and a water resources management specialist at the World Bank Group and environment science, technology, and health officer for China and the U.S. Department of State, where he worked extensively on the Paris Agreement on climate change. before entering public service. He was a Georgia Ruffolo postdoctoral research fellow with the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. He was also awarded the Council of Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, the National Committee on U.S. China Relations Public Intellectuals Program Fellowship, the Fulbright Fellowship, and the Truman Scholarship. His research and commentary on a wide range of environmental and international affairs issues has appeared in a range of leading scholarly journals and also media outlets, including Nature, the China Quarterly, Foreign Affairs, and the New York Times. Dr. Moore holds doctoral and master's degree from Oxford University, where he was a Rogers Scholar, and an undergraduate degree from Princeton. I hope I gave all the information. So for you, I would like to abord this first. One of your books, actually the last one, is called China's Next Act. You talk about climate change and how this affects the conflict over water. And regarding this, I believe you have a lot to say to us. I would like to link some events that we are seeing nowadays, for example, to bring this into reality too, in order for those who are watching us to see if there is any link. So you could explain to us, for example, the floods in Kentucky, Biden went there to visit, floods in South Korea. So how those events are linked with sustainable energy and also cooperation between countries. How can we, maybe it's not a simple thought, but how can we link those events that we are seeing nowadays in the television and internet with the shared development between countries?
On one note in kind of my background, and that's that I did spend a bit of time, as you kindly noted, at the State Department, and I had this portfolio, which is called Environment, Science, Technology, and Health. Now, having come out of graduate school, you know, when I found out that that was my job, I thought it was somewhere between laughable and downright dangerous to expect like one person to keep track of so many different topics, and in some ways it is. And yet, what I discovered is that that's by far the most technical kind of portfolio in the State Department. And most of my colleagues were focused on what were at the time, this was almost a decade ago when I was at State. My colleagues were focused on what was at the time thought of as the more important kind of bigger picture, more strategic issues, primarily around trade and investment and political military issues. Now, neither of those have gone away. But in the last decade, I think what we've seen is that when it comes to China's role in the world, increasingly that is centered in these two areas of response to shared ecological challenges. Climate is the best example, but I would also include the pandemic in that, and then also technology. And the other thing that has changed over the last decade is that when I was doing this job and trying to cover many of these different issue areas, we really saw them as the foundation for cooperation and a constructive relationship with China. Some at the time even advocated that by cooperating on climate change and public health and science and technology issues, we could sort of help integrate China in some ways as a responsible stakeholder in the international system. Flash forward to where we are today, and it's exactly the opposite, particularly in the science and technology arena. In the United States, that is seen as an arena for competition rather than cooperation. And so we've sort of, I think, had this interesting and in many ways paradoxical shift. On the one hand, sustainability and technology has become much more important to the U.S. China relationship and China's role in the world. And yet, for the most part, those issues have started to become seen more as areas of competition than cooperation. Until recently, climate change was an exception, but as you may have seen in response to U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's recent visit to Taiwan, the Chinese side has decided to suspend all bilateral dialogue on climate change. So unfortunately, that too has kind of fallen prey, so to speak, to this idea of competition. So I think it's an interesting dilemma, and one that I try to explore in the book, to say that even as our focus has shifted, we've started to think of these shared, what are in many ways shared challenges, more through competition than cooperation. I do think, and just as a final thought before turning it back to you and to my fellow panelists, Patricia, I think what we risk kind of getting wrong, at least in the US in our response to these shifts, are first of all, not paying enough attention to the need for cooperation in the technology realm. Certainly from a US policy perspective, there is a lot of commitment to sustaining cooperation in climate change. But when you look at emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, gene editing, there's a tremendous need for multilateral dialogue on shared rules of the road, so to speak, to guide the development of these technologies. And we're not giving nearly enough attention to that. And on the other hand, I think there's actually some scope for economic competition when it comes to clean technology development. And we can certainly talk more about that. My fellow panelists are well versed in that as well. But those are two kind of concerns and conclusions that I came to through researching and writing the book.
So taking this, that Scott just said to us, that the scenario nowadays is this arena is more for competition and no cooperation. And so how do you think that the goals that many countries put in order to achieve a sustainable energy, they can really be a reality? In United States, we have a special envoy for climate change, and a lot has been said about cooperation, this word, cooperation with other countries in order to develop clean energy. So if what we have, according to Scott, it's a competition, how can we have those goals achieved? And please feel free to share the graphics that you said you have to share with us.
Sure, thanks. I'll put up the slides now. Just to give you, maybe let me first begin by maybe just taking some minutes to discuss the report for the Hinrich Foundation that I wrote earlier this year. You can see the slides up there now, I hope. So as you opened us with, Patricia, I think often that Europe's competitiveness in certain critical and emerging technologies is often forgotten, particularly in the American debate on rivalry with China. And I think that's often because China may be in front of the US, for example, when it comes to mobile network technology and its champion Huawei. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily in front of other industry players in Europe, but also elsewhere in East Asia. And I think that it's important that we put a focus on Europe's competitiveness, exactly because these are not only industries that are important for European welfare, their well-being, but also important for addressing climate change, where the wind industry is concerned, and powering and connecting Industry 4.0, which is where mobile technologies are concerned. So if I can begin by sort of just giving you the scope of the companies I'm speaking about, and the European champions, so to speak. It's very much centered where I am today in the Nordic region. In telecoms, you have Ericsson from Sweden and Nokia from Finland that are front runners, along with Huawei and ZTE in China, and Samsung of South Korea as well. And in wind power, it's Vestas, a Danish multinational, and Siemens Gamesa, a German-Spanish wind turbine manufacturer. And they compete mainly with GE from the United States, as well as an assortment of Chinese companies, but those in particular that have started to emerge internationally include Goldwind, Envision, and others that I'll touch on more. But I want to sort of present how these European companies actually face up against their Chinese rivals in particular. And for anyone following the telecom industry, this graph is probably familiar, and the light blue line shows this dramatic rise of Huawei in global market shares in mobile networks over the last 15 years or so. Huawei and its Chinese counterpart ZTE went from representing around 10% of the global market to around 40% from over the last 15 years or so. And I think that Huawei's rise is a phenomenal feat, as many have pointed out. But I think the West, in particular, went from underestimating China's tech abilities to now overestimating China's tech capabilities. And I'll offer an example of the Ericsson CEO, Karl-Heinrich Svanberg, who back in 2005 saw Huawei and ZTE as being long away from really competing with the Nordic telecoms. But just 4 years later, he commented on how impressed he was with the rapid catch up and of Huawei in the industry. But more recently, we see this sort of overestimation of Huawei and Chinese technology. The Wall Street Journal just a few years ago had an article about how Huawei took over the world, and The Economist recently asked, is there even an alternative for this corporation? The reality is, of course, there is an alternative. There has been alternatives in Europe and East Asia for quite some time. And if you sort of look at this graph of market share by region, we can see that Nokia and Ericsson lead Huawei and ZTE in every region of the world except for the Asia Pacific. And that's because China and Huawei and ZTE's strong shares in China bring it up there. And because China is the largest telecom industry in the world, it has brought up Huawei and ZTE's shares globally as well. Even in the developing world, where Huawei and ZTE are often pointed to as the dominant players, it's actually Ericsson and Nokia that still have a majority of the shares in those industries. This data is from 2018, so it's somewhat dated, but it actually comes before the campaign, the U.S. campaign against Huawei, which will see its stakes, particularly in Europe and some parts of Asia, India notably, fall. So it's the same story when it comes to the tech competitiveness of Huawei and ZTE. So I see Huawei as a tech leader in mobile network technology, but it's not the tech leader. Europe's importance can be seen in the essentiality of the patents that Nokia and Ericsson are passing, right? So not all patents are created equal. Quality matters, and Huawei often leads in number counts in quantity, but in quality, it depends on sort of the market intelligence firm that's doing the study. In this, very quickly in this analysis, Samsung and Nokia were out front. Here, Huawei and Samsung are out front. And in this one, it's Ericsson and Samsung. So you see, it depends on the methodology that's being used. And depending on one's political preference, you can find a market intelligence firm that argues the case for your company. So it's really still quite a close race where technology is concerned too, between Huawei, Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung, and others. Let me take just a few more minutes to talk about wind. Now, the European companies are even in a better position than their counterparts in telecom when it comes to wind turbine manufacturers. They make up over 2/3 of the global wind market. They are in, so Vestas and Siemens Gamesa and a few others are at the forefront of every region except for China's market. So they are very much in the leadership role when it comes to market share. But of course, China's market really matters. Here we see how much China's wind industry has been growing. It's became the largest growing wind industry in the world already in 2009. And in the last couple of years has been representing over 50% of growth in onshore and offshore wind, so 50% globally. So China matters, and these Chinese companies, there's around a dozen of them, have really controlled that market, and Vestas and Siemens Gamesa and GE really have small single-digit shares in the Chinese market. So because of the importance of the Chinese market, we're seeing that Chinese wind turbine manufacturers are really starting to dominate the top 10, top 15 largest wind turbine companies. But this is really from their activities in China. Now, the technology story is similar, or the Chinese wind turbine manufacturers still somewhat have a weaker position than the Chinese telecom industry. And again, it comes to a question of quantity of patents over quality of patents. So China represented 36%, around 40% of total patents in wind power in recent years. But only 2% of their, close to 17,000 patents, for example, we see 2019 results, only 2% of those were actually world-class. Europe, led by Germany and Denmark, over 50% of their patents are world-class. So again, we see that we have to unpack technology by quality, not necessarily the quantity of the patents. But one should not discount China and China's innovation. China, excels at process innovation, and it's brought down the cost of major components in turbine manufacturing dramatically over the past 10 years. Some wind turbines, for example, by one estimate, cost what's being produced in China costs half as much as what's being produced outside of the Chinese market. And China excels at artificial intelligence and other tech areas that are becoming more and more important to the future of the wind industry and managing smart wind farms and keeping costs down through those technology. So one shouldn't, of course, count China out in this tech race. But I just wanted to point out how the European, particularly in the wind industry, the European competitors are still very much at the forefront. They're under pressure. The Chinese companies are taking gradual steps out of the Chinese market, similar to what Huawei did two decades ago. And we're seeing that also even European wind turbine manufacturers are developing products in China, producing them in China, and then exporting them to Europe. So China remains a key production venue for the wind industry. And Chinese companies also get advantages from the Belt and Road Initiative. We see a larger proportion of the finance that is still going towards BRI is made up of wind and solar. So they get advantages from that as well. And so to finish off with the question you posed competition is not necessarily a bad thing, particularly when it comes to the wind industry and addressing climate change, because wind needs to make up something like 35% of global electricity production by 2050 to meet the Paris Climate Agreement. But we also need to remember that the wind industry is big business, and people's economic welfare, people's jobs, people's incomes, government's tax revenues depend on having those wind industries located in their borders. And I think I'll leave with one point from my conclusions, which is that it's important, I think, for European policymakers and political leaders to realize that industrial policies passed in China, as well as those passed in the US, can actually split the interests of European multinationals and the wider European supply chain in the wind industry in particular. One example is the fact that components can be made cheaper in China. That's great news for companies like Vestas and Siemens Gamesa. They can buy the components cheaper and from Chinese suppliers, but it's bad news for European suppliers and for European jobs. And we see production facilities closing here in Europe for some turbine components. And consider the Inflation Reduction Act that's going through in the United States. Vestas share price rose by 15% when that was announced, because it's going to be big business for Vestas, but it's going to be big business producing turbines in the United States, which is what's required from the act. and that manufacturing will be US based. So good for Vestas, but maybe not as good for the Danish economy and the European economy. So we need to really unpack these questions of competition and cooperation where wind and telecom are concerned, because they have broader consequences than just the lead firms or the governments behind them, but also the broader economic welfare that they bring about. But I'll stop there. Thanks for your patience.
Okay, thanks, Luke. So, Ilaria, from everything that Luke just said to us, you investigated and researched the role of local governments in China, right, while developing some clean energy and electric vehicles, for example. Luke mentioned the supply chain in the world, which has been affected in the past months. So how do you see this now, this new reality that we are seeing in the world, and this background conversations in between countries, and how to have elements to produce technology and everything which is necessary for this market? So how can you, so the question is, what is the main role of local governments in this new scenario that everything changed so much, right? So the connections are not the same. And I'm talking about the war in Ukraine, for example. So do you see the same effort or the same commitment from a couple of months ago in comparison of what we have now regarding China, Europe, and United States?
Yes, thank you. So I think what we're seeing now, and your question has a lot of different components, so I'll try and get to a few of them. So I think in terms of supply chains, what we've been seeing, I think, for a few years now, but I think since the beginning of the pandemic and now with the war in Ukraine, really it's been crystallized, is that from a situation in which supply chains were allowed to develop according to sort of economic efficiencies or multinationals' preferences, they've now become increasingly a political concern, right? So it's definitely in Washington, but I think increasingly in Brussels as well, and definitely in Beijing. Actually, I think that's worth mentioning. There is a concern that without increasing redundancies in the supply chain, so without having redundancies at home, to make up for potential shortages in supply chains internationally, that there is an international national security risk. So I think we're seeing in response to that an increase in industrial policy, and I think as much as I support the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that's part of that, right? The CHIPS Act. CHIPS Act we've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in the US, we've seen it in a lot of other countries. This sort of semiconductors, we've definitely seen this concern that having one sort of streamlined supply chain is actually a risk rather than an advantage. Mm-hmm. And I think we've seen that also in clean tech industries. Now, local governments, how they fit into this, I think that's an interesting question. I think in part the challenge is that local governments are often more concerned with jobs internationally, I would say, in the US, in Europe, in China, than they are with potentially big national security issues. So I think what you may end up seeing is certain local governments trying to perhaps attract foreign investment, even perhaps and we've seen this in the US where, for example, we've had Chinese companies invest in areas like California, right? BYD opened a bus factory in California, and that actually came into conflict with what Washington felt was sort of its national security interests, right? So I think we may end up seeing more of that. And for example, I think we've seen now in Thuringia in Germany, the CATL, the battery factory has been opening up. It will be opening up supposedly, or Tesla. And I think, for jobs, for even supply chains, that's probably great. I think there probably are concerns about there may be concerns, at least in the future, about whether that's the type of investment we want, right? So I think we're going to see more and more of that conflict of, we want more relocalizing supply chains, for friendshoring, but where do we want that investment coming from? And I think that's actually very hard to reconcile, and I think we'll probably see more and more of that conversation and conflict, perhaps, in how the discourse proceeds.
And do you see those talks are clear and direct between local governments, even from here in the United States and China, regarding the last events, for example, Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan, and the response that China gave, saying that they are not committed the way they were in the past regarding their commitment in the development of clean energy and technology. So how those talks were affected, and the goals might be affected from your perspective?
That's a good question. I mean, I think despite all the challenges in the past few years over U.S. China competition, there was actually a pretty strong local government. Some channels were still open for local governments to communicate. I think that's going to be increasingly challenging. I don't have the latest data, perhaps Scott does, but I do think that's going to be increasingly challenging in a situation where all the sort of national government channels are being shut down, right? So I think for example, California has very strong subnational channels with China on climate. I do think it's probably going to become much harder for them. And I don't actually know how they've been affected by the announcement that China is suspending climate cooperation, for example. I'm not actually sure, but I do imagine that even if they're allowed to continue, it's probably going to be a much more challenging environment for that kind of conversation. It's just like it's been more challenging to have scientific cooperation, for example, right? Which is perhaps it's definitely been a very important thing in the past, right? I think as Scott mentioned, and I think that's been much more challenging in this because of pandemic, because of U.S. China competition, because of political challenges in the U.S. And I think that's going to be even more challenging going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Scott, do you have a follow-up regarding this thing?
Quick things, and then would be happy to turn to either concluding thoughts from my fellow panelists or questions if we have some from participants. But first of all, I just wanted to kind of underscore a key point that I think Luke made, which and Laurie as well, but that what we kind of tend to see across a lot of different technology issue areas is that China's competitive advantage, it tends to rely more on the deployment side of the equation rather than the development side. That's a generalization. It's not always true. And the kind of automatic follow-up is, but the gap is narrowing, even at the cutting edge in virtually every technology area. So it's not, that's not an observation that, should lead us to kind of say, well, this whole technology competition thing is bogus. That's not the conclusion that should be drawn. But I think what it does suggest, and again, I think Luke's report did a great job of highlighting some of these dimensions and implications, is what we should do about it, how we should respond to concerns around technological competition or China's investments in advanced technology. And again, this is a point that Ilaria made. The kind of main response, I think, especially in the US, but to my understanding in Europe as well, has been essentially to rediscover industrial policy after having forgotten it for most of the last 30 years, or at least kind of shied away from it. And I think there are certainly some areas in which that's justified. I think 5G is one of those, primarily because it's not just about the technology, it's also about freedom of expression and ensuring that there's sort of a marrying of the kind of global communications background, or backbone rather, with the ability to preserve important fundamental values. I think there's also a strong case in areas like semiconductors, but once you get outside of that, I think the case for kind of pursuing industrial policy weakens a little bit, and especially in the US with the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, that's really become our default mode. is to think primarily in terms of industrial policy. And I do worry that we're going a little bit too far in that direction, given that industrial policy comes with a lot of downsides. And I think you see that in the case of China, and the generally, for all of the, even though China is increasing its capabilities in virtually every technological arena, I think you also have to say that the kind of bang for the buck has been low, given the scale of investment over decades by Beijing. And so I think that we just risk kind of going too far. One final point I would make, which kind of gets to the subnational point that we just referenced. So, one thing I try to think about in the book is, okay, we're in a very antagonistic kind of rivalrous situation when it comes to China, especially in the U.S. What do we do about the fact that we're nonetheless in the same boat, whether it comes to climate change or emerging technologies? And one answer is to try to do more at the subnational level, because it is less politicized and there is a little bit more freedom of action. I hasten to add, though, that it's no substitute. Ultimately, whether it's climate cooperation subnationally or dialogues on sort of technological norms between researchers or universities, ultimately to kind of scale that up and to get policy action, you need national government buy-in. So it's a way to try to sort of rebuild trust from the ground up, but it's no substitute for an improvement in national kind of level ties or in the bilateral relationship. And I think that fundamentally is the challenge that we face going forward, is how to do that. I would just sort of conclude by pointing out, and I think climate is really the area where there is maybe a little bit of hope for progress, despite the kind of rivalry and divergence. And I just think it's notable to point out that the most ambitious U.S. climate policy action has been the Inflation Reduction Act. In his press conference urging Congress to pass that legislation, President Biden specifically said that it would help the U.S. compete more effectively with China. So at least,
Scott, a lot has been said about this the Inflation Reduction Act, and could you please explain in a more broad way for those who are watching us exactly what you just said, but in a practical way, in reality, how this is helpful and how this is positive?
Kind of Orwellian language, the Inflation Reduction Act, most economists believe will probably not do much to reduce inflation at all. But what it will do is create a raft of incentives to accelerate what people refer to as the clean energy transition, meaning a kind of substitution of fossil fuel infrastructure and technologies, internal combustion, swapping internal combustion engines for electric vehicles, for example, hopefully accelerating the adoption of renewables. And essentially, the bill tries to do this by creating a whole bunch of financial incentives to get people to do this, to adopt these technologies. Whether they do is, of course, a little bit of an open question, but most of the independent analysts that have looked at this have concluded that probably the bill will put the U.S. on track to reduce emissions by 40% over 2005 levels. So that's a big reduction. And again, I think it's notable that achievement has been done really almost because of competition with China. I think that's sort of an interesting observation, given that we tend to think, the kind of conventional wisdom is that we can only make progress on cutting emissions through some type of cooperation.
Okay, look, a question that we have here, and let's see how we can answer this question. Why 5G matters so much, and what is involved behind the implementation of this technology?
Sure. I think a lot of the security concerns that we hear about involving 5G are not necessarily just because of just because of China's role and Huawei's role as a leader in in that industry, but also because of just the nature of this new technology and the unknown applications from it. So 5G is really going to allow massive amounts of data to be shared at much faster speeds and with much lower latency, so less sort of delays in sending information between devices, between machines. It's mainly a driver for Industry 4.0. So we're talking about automated factories, robotics, and we see that small 5G networks are already being rolled out, particularly in China, but also in South Korea, the U.S, and even in some in Europe for these industrial purposes. But 5G, in the coming, 5 to 10 years, as it, increases its applications, we'll see it affect our own, daily lives as well. The big pie in the sky is how it will enhance automated driving, driverless vehicles. And that is still sort of, I think, more of a long-term goal than an immediate possibility. But
when you talk about long-term goal, you're saying 10 years?
Yeah, so the experts,
years?
The tech experts that follow this say by the end of this decade, we'll start to see 5G really, permeating the societal space, through smart cities, through immersed entertainment, through remote healthcare. But automated driving, that cars communicating with one another on roads is, I think, even later in the 2030s, if not beyond that this will really gather pace. So this, because of the interconnectedness that 5G is really going to be driving, it really matters who your developers are, who is providing the software updates for these networks, and whether you trust them, and whether you can screen those software for possible flaws or deliberate sort of backdoors in the software. And therefore it's become such a security issue. And there's debates about how whether it's possible and how easy it is to screen this software. But it's really these backdoors and possibilities for hacking, for accessing information, for shutting down electrical systems or hospitals connected with these networks. That's where the fear lies with 5G. And with the current networks, we don't have that type of interconnectedness. So that concern wasn't there when 4G came out. So that is really sort of the background on why 5G has become such a crucial issue economically, but also for security issues.
Is China, in your opinion, more exposed regarding technological risks with this technology, 5G?
Sure. I mean, China is exposed to in the same way as we are in Europe and the United States to
it's the same exposure, you think? It's not a different one?
I mean, I can't comment really on the strengths of China's cyber defenses, but we see that both sides being affected by independent and government hacks of networks in China and in the West.
Larry, a question I believe it can be answered by you. Can we think in a world with Europe and United States with total independence from China regarding technology and generation of power?
Probably not. I think on the whole, I think that's what a lot of people, and I think there's a lot of talk about this, but if you look at the supply chains, most of these supply chains go through China, right? And not necessarily for the whole thing, but if you look at, for example, batteries, right? Cathodes and anodes, which is one of the sort of materials in the upstream that are necessary to create a battery, most of those are produced in China. Now we can try and ramp up that production in Europe and the US, but it's currently less than 10% globally. So I think, it's just very challenging to think of supply chains that are completely free of China, right? I just think that's incredibly challenging. Now, that said, I do think sometimes there's a lot of concern about, the risks of relying on Chinese national risk, given the reliance on supply chains, when it comes to energy independence, right? And there's a lot of other challenges, human rights, et cetera. But when it comes to just energy independence, you install a solar panel, you don't need to change it for 30 years, right? So it's not the same as a gas pipeline where somebody can turn off the gas and you're entirely reliant on that supply of gas, right? So I think it's a little different. So if we're talking about energy independence, I think we can get a little bit closer to that. But I think when it comes to the actual technology, a lot of these technologies come from globalized supply chains. And I should say the same happens for China. It's not like they are completely independent in a lot of their supply chains, right? And I think if you look at semiconductors, that's a really good example. For example, I think there's a lot of concern about China's advances in semiconductors, but if you look at it from the Chinese perspective, that's actually a really big area of vulnerability for them. In their view. Yeah.
Scott, I would like to refer the same question for you and your point of view. If you from your perspective, if you agree with Laria, if it's possible to have a total independence from China regarding technology and clean energy, if United States and Europe, if they can be totally independent regarding this matter.
Thanks, Patricia. And as we were just going through this round of questions, it occurred to me, oftentimes, it's kind of good to get contrasting opinions from panelists, but on the other hand, sometimes it's good to just have a consensus across the board. And I don't think, I don't think I would disagree with a single thing that my co-panelists have said. I think that's absolutely true. And again, I think to me that kind of underscores the limits of this kind of approach of, part of it is kind of rediscovering industrial policy, as I said, but as Ilaria pointed out, I mean, another key aspect of it is this kind of, it's almost an assumption that you can kind of reshore or decouple supply chains away from China. And I think in most cases that is impractical. And even where it is possible, it's unaffordable. And I think
unaffordable. Could you explain this, please? Why it is unaffordable?
Because you have to essentially recreate the infrastructure that's been built from 40 years of interdependence and global trade. If you want to reshore supply chains and basically create a nationally self-sufficient supply chain for every critical or strategic material, that is an inordinately expensive exercise and one that would just be far beyond the capabilities of any economy, including the U.S. We spent 4 decades building an interdependent global trade system. I think, for some understandable reasons, we're deciding maybe we want to, move away from that a little bit, but it's impossible to totally to ever go back.
So Scott, could be a naive question, but from everything that we're discussing here today, and as we have competition and more competition rather than cooperation, and if it's difficult to rebuild the model that it has been constructed in the past 40 years, so we might think that in this world, okay, everybody can be competitors, but everybody needs to be friends. Like we have to see like friendship around the world, and it's not what we are seeing, right? With all conflicts, armed conflicts, and responses from the East and the West. So it might be a kind of a naive question, but are we in the right path, the right way? If it's difficult to rebuild the model, and if we are competitors and we don't see as much friendship as we should see?
Excellent question. Philosophers will spend decades to make. Let me try to offer a really quick thought, and then my co-panelists may want to respond too. I think there are several very legitimate criticisms of this kind of model that we've built. of really kind of interdependent, very liberal kind of trade regime, especially when it comes to China and the developed economies. And I think the most compelling of those critiques are around sustainability on one hand, and just sort of dislocation and economic inequality on the other. I think to the extent that we move away from that system to try to address those concerns and critiques, we can lay the foundation for a more sustainable world and a more equitable world, and hopefully a more peaceful world. But I think to the extent we go beyond that and we try to pretend that it's possible to kind of turn away from each other, I think that's a dead end. And sorry if this sounds like an advertisement, but the last kind of sentence in my book is that in an era of climate change, pandemics, and emerging technology, in the end, China needs the rest of the world and vice versa to succeed. And I genuinely believe that that's true. We can't turn our backs on one another.
Okay. Look, a question here that we have: how small companies and startups could collaborate or could be part of this international competition in 5G industry? Is it possible to have small companies and startups in a world so competitive, in a sense of that graphic that you showed with us, with very few companies leading this competition? So for those small investors and startups, is it possible to think in a world more diverse?
Yeah, I certainly the graphic I showed of sort of the lead firms in these industries is misleading. There is an ecosystem in Sweden, in Finland, in China, in the U.S. That is much more diverse than just the Ericsson and Huawei's of the world. So these companies are dependent on research and development and expertise and services and supplies from an assortment of suppliers, from an assortment of companies, and there's ample opportunity to enter that space. For the wind industry as well. In Denmark, one of the provinces here, Jutland, really the birthplace of the global wind industry, is dotted with communities that have suppliers that are making wind towers, that are designing new types of blades. So you have this sort of broader ecosystem and wider supply chain that support the larger companies. And unfortunately, our research, our reporting, our policy analysis often just focuses on these lead firms, when I think in many respects, the economic interests of a country are often connected with actually the wider supply chain, the smaller players. And I think China, among the other countries, has understood that much better than we have in the West in recent decades, that China gets the fact that controlling the supply chain as much as you can has tremendous economic benefits for your population. They employ, it brings employment, it brings taxes, it brings income that can feed back into the economy. Whereas our sort of this rush of offshoring that took place for some decades really sort of hollowed that out in a lot of Western industries. And now we don't see a reshoring taking place. I don't think there are many that are pushing for complete independence from China. China has a place in these supply chains, but it is important for strategic reasons to, I think, wean off some of these dependencies, to lower some of these dependencies in critical industries, to
lower these dependencies.
Exactly. So take Ericsson as an example. Ericsson is in a process of creating dual production. So it's opened up a new 5G network equipment plant in Louisville, Texas. It's been opening up new plants here in Europe, in Estonia and Poland. It has production facilities in Brazil. And its China production is still large, but it's mostly focused on supplying the Chinese market, the African market, some markets in Asia, where they are just being sort of forced because of geopolitics to do the impractical, to do the expensive decisions, and that is, making these new production facilities in the U.S. But that's just sort of a nature of their business. And I think you could see in the wind industry as well, there's a lot of localization demands from governments around the world, the US most recently, but India, Brazil, every country, of course, wants these components ideally produced within their borders. So these demands are coming on companies in many ways, whether they like it or not, and they're going to have to adjust. But it doesn't mean sort of a decoupling from China. I think it just means a sort of a weaning off of dependencies in critical industries.
Larry, are you that investigated the Chinese industrial policy? Do you believe that there is it a place for investment and development of small business and startups that could be equally that could be competitive in an equally way with bigger companies?
In China, you mean?
In China, exactly. Or
yeah, I mean, I think actually Luke is right that in China there's been an understanding for a while that if you have, if you capture more of the supply chain, you get more jobs, right? And that there's benefits there. But so I think we've seen that in some industries. I also think in China there's been a tendency with industrial policy, and we've seen this in a lot of different industries, to sort of create an almost overinvestment. So you tend to get overcrowding in a lot of these industries. You've seen it in electric vehicles, you've seen it in semiconductors, you've seen it in a lot of different, you've seen it in steel, right? Not just high tech, right? And you get to this sort of overcrowding. And then because of industrial policy, and then the government, the theory is, and then you sort of weed out the best, right? But it's been a real challenge in a lot of these areas because you get in local governments that have interests. So that's why China has hundreds of car makers, for example, right? Even though these are not particularly successful companies. So that's actually a challenge, that's sort of a, certainly very good for some small companies, not necessarily good for the economy as a whole, or even for the government that's supporting a lot of these companies. And these are not necessarily companies that are very successful. But in some industries, you do see that this does produce some real winners. So it is a kind of a different model. I'm not saying that it is a best model to imitate, but there's in some areas there's been the space for small companies. I will say on the whole, I think Beijing still prefers larger SOEs or private companies that that they identify as little giants or dragon heads or whatever it is, the different labels for leading companies that the government sees as champions. So that's not always beneficial to small companies, I will say.
Scott, if you could please answer this question: is wind power a possibility for other parts of the world, a part of the Europeans?
Resource that where there is a lot of geographic variation in terms of availability, but yeah, I mean, it's certainly a very widely applicable technology. Especially as offshore becomes more mature. The thing I would note, though, is that when it comes to integrating wind power, the main technology the main concern isn't really with the turbine technology itself, and more with grid integration. And actually, there's an important China connection in that one technology where China is, in most respects, a world leader. Is in what's called ultra high voltage transmission. And that means creating essentially really efficient electrical lines that are able to, again, efficiently transmit power over long distances. And that's really important because in most use cases around the world, there is a significant distance between where the highest wind and solar generation capacities are and where the load centers are. In other words, where the demand is, large cities. So typically, it's sort of actually an interesting just coincidence of geography, I guess, around the world, that oftentimes those are very different. And so you need this technology, ultra high voltage transmission, to integrate renewables into electricity grids and meet particularly urban power demand. So that's an example of where China is an important kind of has a really important piece of the global clean tech puzzle. Contribute key piece of the global clean tech puzzle.
In some part of the world, for example, in Latin America, the power relies a lot in water, and with all those problems regarding climate change, how do you see that part of the world, Latin America, being affected? How the countries generate power? It relies a lot in water, basically. We don't see wind power.
Yeah, well, and one of the sort of hard realities in some ways of our kind of current energy mix around the world is that the majority of renewable energy, especially if you discount, as most people do, nuclear from what you think of as sort of renewable or low carbon, hydro makes up the bulk of that, both in China and around the world. And that is a little bit concerning for three reasons. One, it's environmentally not great. It's very low carbon, but it has negative effects for aquatic ecosystems. Tends to inundate large areas. Second, most of the good hydropower sites around the world are already built out, so there's very little additional capacity that we can expect. So it's not a great solution for meeting future power demand growth. And the third thing is that because of climate change, hydro is becoming less dependable. As we have now more extreme cycles of flooding and drought, it's a less dependable energy resource in many parts of the world. And you're seeing, particularly in places like Southern Africa, a little bit less so Latin America, but there as well, that there have been more extreme periods of drought and water shortage. And as a result, hydropower generation capacity has been reduced. So it's important, but is not ideal for all of those reasons. One other thing that is important to note is that most foreign firms kind of got out of the hydropower construction business a couple decades ago, and Chinese firms are really the only game in town when it comes to building large hydro projects. So if you are looking to build a new hydropower dam, you don't really have many alternatives to Chinese construction firms.
Okay, we're almost running out of time, so I'm gonna leave here for the last considerations of the three of you, starting with Ilaria first. As we discussed here today, and you believe that it's not possible, right? Total independence from this side of the world, from China. From your perspective, what is the main message that we should share with our audience regarding everything that we discussed here today? Anything you would like to add?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is a very challenging moment, because we are seeing actually these industries really taking off all over the world. And I think there is a real balance between understanding how to balance national interests, global challenges, as well as the structure of these supply chains and what's actually doable and what's desirable. So I think there's going to be a lot of room for researchers like us or journalists. I think this is a great moment to be looking at this. I think it's quite challenging for policymakers, but I think ultimately there's going to be a lot of commercial opportunities. And one thing I would like to just point out is we always talk about competition or cooperation. I think in some ways it depends on what we're talking about, because commercial competition is probably a good thing. And it really relies on a base level of cooperation, right? Of recognizing certain basic rules and the standards and that sort of thing. So I think it's worth just noting that sometimes it's worth the understanding better what it even means, the cooperation competition framework and these words, these concepts. So that's what I'll leave you with.
Okay, thank you. So Luke, your final considerations and anything you might think that it's helpful to add here with us.
I think for researchers and journalists and policymakers and the general public, I think when it's important when we're considering sort of the the changes that are coming with new technologies, with addressing climate change, with fighting global pandemics, and in dealing with global challenges, that we don't view the world through a U.S. China rivalry lens, right? That there are other so-called middle powers, whether it's here in Europe or East Asia, that have capabilities that often go overlooked. I don't think just a few years ago many would have thought too long about the importance of the Taiwanese company TSMC in the semiconductor industry. Now that's becoming more common knowledge as the tensions over the strait rise, and I think the same is true for other European and other East Asian capabilities, Japan, South Korea, and also those in Europe in other technologies. And if you, I think, view the world made up of a more diverse set of players, we might be able to come to more compromise and might be able to find more solutions than just viewing the world as sort of a titanic struggle between the United States and China.
Okay, look, thank you very much. Scott, your final considerations and anything you would like to add here with us. It's such a privilege to discuss this topic with the three of you. So Scott, please.
Well, likewise, a real privilege. I would echo Luke in particular, and I would just kind of add that again, really the premise of my book is that I think we have to start to think about China through these two lenses of sustainability, which is another way of saying kind of shared global ecological challenges on one hand, and technology on the other. And I think when increasingly the other kind of China-related issues that we're used to more traditionally thinking about, trade, Taiwan, human rights, are all kind of being channeled through these newer issue areas. Again, I think Speaker Pelosi's visit is a good example of that. This is the oldest and deepest fissure in U.S. China relations, the status of Taiwan. And yet, if you look at China's response, the single most kind of impactful and noteworthy diplomatic response was to suspend dialogue on climate change. And I think that's a good example of how we increasingly see these kind of older China-related issues and the issues that we're used to kind of thinking of as central to the China relationship, increasingly being kind of focused through either sustainability or technology. They don't make the kind of relationship with China or thinking about China any less problematic and less complex, but they do shift the framework a little bit. And I think they certainly push us to think about how we can address shared global challenges really from the basis of very different values. And that's certainly a challenge, but it does create some opportunities. And I think we've talked about both the challenges and some of the opportunities in this conversation.
Scott Moore, thank you very much for your time and the ability to talk with us. I would also like to thank Lyria Mazzocco for your time and for your patience at the beginning with us. Thank you very much. And Luke Pathy, also thank you very much. I would like to thank everybody who joined us virtually in this program. I would like to add here again that this educational program, it's a program made with the participation of Heritage Foundation, which is a unique Asia-based philanthropic organization that works to advance mutually beneficial and sustainable global trade through research and educational programs. This program will be available at the website of the Foreign Press Correspondents Association. Thank you all. Thank you, Luke, again, Lyria and Scott, and have you all a great day. Thank you very much.